The most important vegetable on earth began as a poison. The potato in your kitchen, the one you boil, mash, roast and cut into fries without a second thought, is the descendant of a small, bitter, toxic tuber that grew wild in the mountains of South America. Eaten raw from the ground, its ancestors could make you sick. Some could kill you. And yet this plant went on to become one of the most powerful forces in human history. It fed empires. It doubled the population of a continent. It quietly powered the rise of the modern industrial world. More people on this planet are alive today, in part because of the potato. But the same plant also did something else. It gathered an entire nation into a single, fragile dependence. And then, in the space of a few years, it starved that nation half to death while food was carried out of its ports under armed guard. This is a plant that Europeans once believed was cursed. They thought it caused leprosy. They called it the devil's food and fed it to pigs and prisoners. They were wrong about the curse, but they were not entirely wrong to be afraid. Because the story of the potato is the story of how something we now consider the most ordinary, humble, forgettable thing in the kitchen was, for a time, a matter of life and death for millions of people. And almost none of it is on the bag. To find where the potato comes from, you have to climb. High in the Andes Mountains of South America, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, at altitudes where the air is thin and the nights are freezing, human beings began cultivating the wild potato somewhere around 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. This is one of the oldest agricultural traditions on the planet, and it happened in one of the harshest farming environments on Earth. The wild potato was not the smooth, friendly thing you know. It came in thousands of shapes and colors, knobby and small and often bitter, and many varieties were laced with toxic compounds that the plant used to defend itself against being eaten. These are the same family of poisons found in deadly nightshade, and the potato is in fact a cousin of it. So the people of the Andes did two remarkable things. First, they bred the plant over countless generations, selecting for tubers that were larger, less bitter, and less toxic, until they had transformed a wild defense mechanism into food. To this day, the Andes hold a staggering diversity of potatoes, thousands of distinct varieties, in every color imaginable, a living library that exists nowhere else on Earth. And second, for the varieties that were still toxic, they invented a way to eat them anyway. They discovered that a particular kind of clay, eaten as a thin slurry alongside the potato, would bind to the poisons and carry them safely through the body. In the highest, coldest regions, where only the bitter, toxic potatoes would grow, people ate their food dipped in clay. They turned poison into a meal. Then they did something even more ingenious. In the freezing Andean nights and the strong daytime sun, they learned to preserve the potato almost indefinitely. They would leave the tubers out to freeze in the dark, then tread the water out of them in the day, freezing and thawing and pressing over and over until what remained was a light, dry, storable food that could last for years. They called it chuño. This was the fuel of empire. The Inca, who built one of the largest states in the ancient world across this impossible terrain, ran on the potato and on chuño. Along their roads stood great storehouses filled with preserved potato that fed armies on the march and carried entire populations through the years when the harvest failed. An empire that stretched thousands of miles along the spine of a mountain range was held together in part by a freeze-dried tuber. And there is a darker chapter still. When the Spanish came and found the mountains of silver at a place called Potosi, they forced tens of thousands of Andean people to labor and die in those mines, digging out the silver that would flow back to Europe and finance its wars. What kept those workers alive long enough to work was the same humble food their ancestors had tamed. The potato fed the Inca, and then it fed the men worked to death pulling silver out of the same mountains. For thousands of years, this was the potato's entire world. The Andes, a mountain crop unknown to the rest of the planet. And then, in the 1500s, ships arrived from across an ocean, carrying men who were looking for gold. They found something in these mountains that would prove far more valuable than any metal. They just did not know it yet. When Spanish ships carried the potato back across the Atlantic in the second half of the 1500s, Europe did not know what to do with it. The problem was not the taste. The problem was everything else. The potato was strange. It grew underground in the dark, from ugly lumps rather than from seed like honest grain. It belonged visibly to the nightshade family, plants that Europeans already knew could be deadly. And it appeared nowhere in the Bible, which to many people at the time was reason enough to distrust it entirely. If God had meant for people to eat it, surely he would have mentioned it. So the rumors grew. The potato caused leprosy, people said. It caused fevers. It was unclean. It was the food of the devil. For decade after decade, across much of Europe, the potato was something you fed to pigs or to prisoners or to the desperate poor, but not something a respectable person would willingly put on the table. It took in the end the better part of 2 centuries and a great deal of deliberate persuasion to change that. In France, a man named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier became the potato's great champion. He had survived as a prisoner of war on a diet of little else, and he knew perfectly well that the fear was nonsense. To win people over, he resorted to trickery. He is said to have planted a field of potatoes and posted armed guards around it during the day, making the crop look precious and forbidden, then quietly withdrawn the guards at night so that curious locals would sneak in and steal the plants for themselves. If it was worth guarding, it was worth stealing. If it was worth stealing, it was worth eating. Parmentier did not stop at trickery. He staged elaborate dinners where every dish was made from potatoes and invited the most famous and fashionable people of the age to eat them. He presented bouquets of potato flowers to the king and queen, and the story goes that Marie Antoinette wore the blossoms in her hair, turning the peasant weed, for one glittering moment, into the height of fashion at the French court. In Prussia, the king, Frederick the Great, took a more direct approach. He simply ordered his people to plant potatoes and sent soldiers to enforce it, understanding that a crop which grew reliably in poor soil could mean the difference between a fed population and a starving one. There is a legend that he too used the guarded field trick, posting soldiers around a royal potato plot precisely so that his suspicious subjects would want to steal what looked so valuable. Slowly, grudgingly, it worked. The fear faded, and as it faded, Europe began to discover what the Andes had known all along, that this humble, ugly, distrusted plant was one of the most efficient food-producing machines ever handed to humankind. That discovery was about to change the shape of the entire continent. Here is what Europe had failed for 200 years to understand. An acre of land planted with potatoes produced far more food and far more calories than the same acre planted with grain. The potato grew in cool, damp, poor soils where wheat struggled. It did not need a mill or a bakery, only a pot and a fire. And crucially, it grew underground, which meant that when armies marched across a country burning the fields, as armies constantly did, the grain above ground went up in flames, but the potatoes survived, hidden and safe beneath the soldiers' feet. For a poor family, an acre or two of potatoes and a single cow could provide enough food to live on year after year. It was, for the ordinary people of Europe, something close to food security for the first time in living memory. And the effect on the population was extraordinary. In the century and a half after the potato took hold, the population of Europe surged as it never had before. Historians still argue about exactly how much of that growth to credit to the potato, but few doubt that it was a major force. More reliable calories meant more children survived. More surviving children meant more people, And more people meant something that would reshape the world, because those growing populations did not all stay on the farm. A countryside that could feed itself with less land and less labor freed people to move into the towns and cities, into the mills and the factories of the early industrial age. There is a real argument made by serious historians that the humble potato helped feed the workforce of the Industrial Revolution itself. The crop that Europe had once fed to pigs was now quietly feeding the soldiers of its armies and the laborers of its factories. Some historians go further still. They point out that the great powers of Europe in the same period were locked in near constant war, and that a nation which could feed its people no matter how many times its fields were burned held a quiet, enormous advantage. An army marches on its stomach, and increasingly that stomach was full of potatoes. A crop from a conquered continent had become one of the hidden engines of European power, folded invisibly into the population, the factories, and the armies of the age. The potato had gone from cursed to essential, from the food of the desperate to the foundation of nations. But there is a dangerous thing that happens when a whole population comes to depend on a single crop. When that crop is one of many, a bad year is a hardship. When that crop is everything, a bad year is a catastrophe. And in one country, on the western edge of Europe, the potato had become very nearly everything. In Ireland, by the early 1800s, millions of people had come to depend on the potato almost completely. The reasons were partly the soil and climate, which suited the potato well, and partly a system of land ownership that left the poorest people farming tiny plots they did not own, squeezed onto less and less ground. On a small patch of land, the potato could feed a family where no other crop could. And so the poor of Ireland ate potatoes in enormous quantities for nearly every meal. A working man might eat several kilograms of them in a single day. Worse, much of the country had come to rely on a single variety, prized because it produced so heavily. Field after field, farm after farm, of the same plant, a monoculture. Genetically, vast stretches of the Irish potato crop were nearly identical. You may remember why that is so dangerous, because anything that can kill one such plant can kill all of them. In 1845, it came. A disease, a water mold carried, it is believed, from the Americas, began to spread through the potato fields of Europe. It turned the leaves black and the tubers to foul, rotting mush in the ground. In Ireland, where so much depended on so few varieties of a single crop, it was a death sentence for the harvest. The potatoes rotted in the fields and rotted in the stores. And they came back, blighted, the next year and the year after that. What followed is remembered in Ireland as the Great Hunger. Over roughly the next 7 years, about 1 million people died of starvation and of the diseases that follow starvation. Another 1 million, and eventually more, fled the country entirely, packed onto ships bound for America and Britain and beyond, many of them dying on the voyage. In the space of a few years, Ireland lost around 1/4 of its entire population. Cottages emptied, whole villages fell silent. The country would not recover its numbers for more than a century, and in truth it never has. Now I have to be careful here, because this is the part that turns a natural disaster into something harder to forgive. Ireland, during these years of mass starvation, did not run out of food. It ran out of potatoes. The country continued to produce grain, livestock, butter, and other food in significant quantities throughout the famine. And much of that food was exported, carried out of Irish ports, sometimes under guard, to be sold abroad, while the people who had grown it starved. The government that ruled Ireland responded slowly and then inadequately, and then, in the eyes of many, with a cold indifference dressed up as economic principle. Relief was tied to brutal conditions. Officials wrote about the famine as a natural check on a population they considered too large, some of them treating a mass death as an unfortunate necessity, even a lesson. Families were evicted from their homes for unpaid rent as they starved. I want to be clear that historians still debate the precise balance of causes, of blight, of policy, of poverty, of a system that had trapped millions on tiny plots of a single vulnerable crop. But strip all of that away, and one fact remains. Food left a starving country while its people died, and those in power let it happen. Nobody was ever truly held to account. The men who made those decisions died comfortable and respected, and the humble potato, the crop that had fed the poor of Ireland so faithfully for so long, became forever bound up with one of the great catastrophes of the modern age. The Great Hunger did not only empty Ireland, it remade the world beyond it. The millions who fled did not vanish. They arrived, poor and grieving and often unwanted, in the cities of the United States, of Britain, of Canada and Australia, packed into the holds of ships so deadly that many became known as coffin ships because so many of the passengers never reached the other side. Those who survived crowded into Boston and New York and built new lives out of almost nothing, often met with contempt and signs telling them they need not apply. And yet, within a few generations, the descendants of those starving emigrants would shape the politics, the culture, and the identity of entire nations. Tens of millions of people today can trace their ancestry to that exodus. A significant part of modern America was born out of people forced across an ocean by a rotten potato and a heartless response to it. And the potato itself, far from being finished, went on to conquer the planet. It spread east across Europe and Asia, became a staple in countless countries, and adapted to almost every climate human beings live in. Today, the largest producer of potatoes in the world is not in the Andes, nor in Ireland, nor anywhere in Europe. It is China. The potato has become one of the most important food crops on Earth, feeding billions of people who have no idea that it began as a toxic weed in a South American mountain range. The lesson of Ireland, meanwhile, was not lost on everyone. In the high Andes, where the potato began, farmers had always done the opposite of monoculture. They grew dozens of varieties side by side, on the same hillside, precisely so that no single disease could ever take everything at once. That ancient wisdom, a diversity built up over thousands of years, turned out to be the exact protection that Ireland had lacked. Today, scientists guard that diversity carefully. In seed banks and research centers, and above all in the living fields of the Andes themselves, thousands of potato varieties are preserved because the modern world, like Ireland before it, still leans heavily on a small number of commercial types. The same disease that caused the Great Hunger still exists. It still attacks potato crops around the world every single year. The war against the blight was never won. It is only endlessly being held off. Today, the potato is so ordinary that it has become almost invisible. It is the fries beside your burger, the crisps in the bag, the mash on the plate, the vodka in the bottle. It is one of the most consumed foods on the planet, grown on every inhabited continent, eaten by nearly everyone, and thought about by almost no one. It has become the very definition of plain, cheap, unremarkable food, and that is the strangest part of the whole story, because this plain, cheap, unremarkable thing is one of the most remarkable objects in human history. It is a domesticated poison, tamed over thousands of years by people whose names we will never know, high in the Andes, eating bitter tubers with clay to keep from being sick. It is the crop that Europe feared as the food of the devil, and then leaned on so heavily that it helped double the population of a continent and feed the workers of the industrial age. It is the plant that fed a nation so completely that when it failed, 1 million people died and 1 million more fled across the sea, reshaping the world in the process. All of that history is sitting in the humble potato in your kitchen right now. The empire and the poison, the fear and the salvation, the hunger and the ships. A whole world folded into something you would peel without a thought and throw into a pot. Now you know what it took to get there. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. We publish a new deep dive into the hidden history of everyday food and drink every week. Leave a comment and tell me whether you had ever heard the full story of the Great Hunger before this video. And give it a like so more people find the real history. Thank you for watching.